We've been in the sermon series in the book of Lamentations during the season of Lent, which is really a season of repentance and mourning as we lead towards Easter Sunday, which is basically the big event that the Christian movement really centers around this event, the resurrection of Jesus. And one of the things that we've been talking about in the book of Lamentations is this author is looking back on the history, the most tragic moment in the history of Israel, where the temple is destroyed, their land is taken from them, they're exiled to Babylon, and he's looking back at this catastrophic event. And throughout the book of Lamentations, we've actually been examining how the imagery that's used is just so dark. I mean, there's stories of women being violated, of people being in hunger, and moms having to resort to having to cook their children. Like there's like very visceral, painful images of the fatherless and the widows. And throughout the book of Lamentations, it has this because, again, this is a catastrophic event that's not only just happened to the people of Israel, but it's actually extended. And one of the things that we've been talking about is how being someone who's a follower of Jesus or a Christian does not exempt one from these catastrophic things happening. And it's amazing that in this kind of whole book, it's a book about lamentations, about grief and suffering and sorrow. Now, part of me wishes that this faith thing exempted me from all of that. And yet here's this book that's putting front and center the pain and anguish of difficult circumstances. And what are we supposed to do with that? Now, in this chapter that Gabrielle just read, it starts out, and here's how it starts out, right? If we put up the slide, it basically says, I've been deprived of peace. I've forgotten what prosperity is. So I say, my splendor is gone and all that I had hoped from the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Now, do you see even themes of lament, of sorrow, of anguish? You can see right in the middle of chapter 3. And yet there's this churn that happens as we continue to read. Now, as I talk about this churn that happens in the book of Lamentations, just a heads up, this is the only positive moment in the entire book of Lamentations, all 5 chapters. Here it is. It says, yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. It's like in the middle of all of this anguish and pain, the author, right smack in the middle of this entire book, where it's all lament, he says, yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. And he continues, and if we can go to the next, the Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. And again, the author continues and writes, let him bury his face in the dust. There may yet be hope. Now there's that word yet. Let him offer his cheek to one who would strike him, and let him be filled with disgrace. For no one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. It's almost like, thank God, there's something positive in the midst of all of this lament, in the midst of catastrophic loss, the pain and the lament. I mean, even if you can imagine the season that we're in this COVID-19 pandemic, like over 500,000 people have died in the US alone, and worldwide, it's far greater than that. I mean, can you imagine just how painful this whole season has been? And for the people of Israel, there's, again, this is the most catastrophic thing that can happen. This is like a Holocaust that has happened to their people, and they're in absolute misery. And the writer actually includes this moment just as a glimmer of hope. In the midst of absolute darkness, there's just this glimmer of hope. He says, yet this I will call to mind. Now, I think it brings up this point for anyone in their own human journey, is that we are to be a people who stray far from all or nothing thinking. Now, here's what I mean by all or nothing thinking. Like, for instance, we even talked about how some religious communities might say that this is what faith is about. Faith is about we're happy and blessed at all times, that every single day we are a blessed people, and forget about suffering and difficulty. We are happy and blessed, and we know it, and we're going to cling to that. Well, I think the book of Lamentations demonstrates, and the entire kind of Christian perspective demonstrates, that that's not really a realistic portrayal of life. That if we have this all or nothing thinking of life is all blessing and very little pain, then we've actually missed out on a very unique and very real perspective of human life. It's that life is actually blessing intermingled with suffering and difficulty, that it's all there. Now, in the same way, if we go to the other extreme and we say life is just awful, it's just full of pain, there is no joy, there is no hope. Well, here's what the author of Lamentations is saying, and here's what jives with the Christian message. It's actually, yes, things might look absolutely bleak. And however, there's just this glimmer of hope that is offered by the author that tells us, no, yet this I will call to mind. I will hope in him. His compassions never fail. We cling to this thing called hope. Now, in each of our lives, it's so tempting to go into all or nothing thinking. So for instance, for those of you who are married, or if you're in a relationship, have you ever tried to pull this move? You've said something like this. Oh my goodness, Tina, my wife, right? Tina, like, you're always so negative. Right? And she's like, always? I'm always so negative. And you probably have quickly learned, much as I have, in any kind of conflict or relationship, whenever we say things like always or never, it's probably not true. In fact, it's likely not true. See how I tried not to use always or never there? Because yeah, it's so easy, especially the way that the human mind works. It's so easy to categorize things as either all good or all bad, and there's no in between. And yet here in the book of Lamentations, there's this glimmer of hope that tells us whenever we get lost into that dark pit, if we can actually cling to hope in the midst of darkness and we avoid all or nothing thinking. There's this one pastor named Erwin McManus out in California, and he tells this story about he actually had gone all in on this one business venture and put all of his personal capital into this business venture. And things happened where this venture ended up plummeting and not doing so well. And he comes home and he says to his wife, he says, Kim, we've lost everything. And his wife, Kim, says to him, I thought I was your everything. And then he says to her, we've lost almost everything. And I just love that story because it's like, yeah, like these moments when we feel like the bottom has fallen through, like we're at the lowest of the low, like we can be reminded that there's this perspective shift that happens when we can, even in the midst of dark times, we can cling to at least some glimmer of hope. You know, in my whole childhood, and I've talked about my childhood a lot, about my relationship with my dad and how much pain I've experienced from my relationship with my dad. And it's funny because sometimes I'll talk to people about it and I'll say, I don't have one positive memory about my father. And because most of the memories that have been seared in my mind are memories of violence, of being overbearing and harsh. And so in my early 20s, I went through counseling, and I'm still seeing a counselor regularly just to process through a lot of things. And what's been interesting in this whole experience with my dad, and we've had so many ups and downs in our own relationship, and so much of the pain that I've experienced as I've kind of gone through life, I would often, I would say in my 20s and probably my early 30s, I had this very one-dimensional view of my father. Like, my father is arrogant, he is harsh, he is violent, he is temperamental, he's a hypocrite. Like, there are all of these things that I was so quick to be able to say about him. And what's interesting is me having become a father now, and me having walked through life a bit more and processed a little bit more, even about my dad, like I look back at my childhood and I realize like, wow, I'm really actually thankful for some things that my dad did teach me when I was younger. I'm really grateful that he put me through some challenging circumstances because he knew that I needed to learn how to navigate a world that was often going to be difficult and challenging. Oh, I really appreciate how my father, like how just the way that he handled money and how he taught me about responsibility related to money. And like, there were all these little things that kind of on the other side of now being a father myself and navigating through my own challenges of moving into this different season of life. Like the picture of my father has changed some. It used to be, he's all bad in this two-dimensional binary way. But now I've realized like my father was a human being who so much pain in his own life, growing up without a father, lost to the Korean War, being an immigrant to a country where he endured the hostilities of racism and was trying to grind and hustle and make it here. And just trying to be a father, a husband, a dad. And it's been interesting for me in my own journey about just seeing my father in this unique way, that instead of this all or nothing perspective, I've been able to just to see the more human elements of him, which is the fact that it's not all or nothing, that there's often these shades of gray. And what I've realized about myself is that my tendency is to go into this is all bad or this is all good. And yet the invitation of the Christian message is to cling somehow into this in between. Now you might be wondering, well, how does the Christian message do this? Maybe you're someone who's not a Christian here and you're like, I haven't experienced Christianity to be like that. Well, just a brief overview of what the Christian story has always been about. See, it starts with beauty, with beautiful. God creates the world in his, and he creates humans in his image. He creates the world and he creates it beautiful. He calls it Tov, and he creates man and women in his own image. And so we are created by a good, beautiful God, and he creates us and it's beautiful. And yet what happens is sin enters the world, where sin and rebellion and us making decisions that we say we don't want God to be God in our lives. In fact, we want to run things our own way. And as a result, here's what Christians believe. The world all of a sudden gets unhinged, and whatever beautiful fabric that had been woven into beauty becomes disoriented and broken. And the world around us, the created world, as well as interpersonal relationships, they experience a whole lot of disappointment. Now, we call that sin, and we call that all sorts of things about not being aligned with the ways of beauty that God has designed us for, but instead it becomes very disappointing. Now, this is the story, though, of Christianity, that we believe that Jesus enters into this world, that God himself enters into this mixture of beauty and disappointment, and he dies on a cross to say that any hardship or difficulty or pain that we experience, that there is hope in another world, there is hope in him, that he is renewing the world, that he has come to be an agent of peace, of kindness, of love, of justice, of beauty again. And so here are the three words that account for the Christian story. It's beautiful, it's disappointing, but it's also hopeful. It's hopeful because we have this ultimate hope that is found in Jesus. We have this living hope that in the midst of a world that feels like everything is being torn apart, in the midst of even a pandemic, we can actually say these words, yet this I call to mind. We can say these words, yet this I call to mind. Yeah, that we can cling to hopefulness, even in our most difficult circumstances. You know, in 1997, there was this film that was created by this Italian filmmaker named Roberto Benigni, and it's a film called Life is Beautiful. And it won an Academy Award for the Best Picture. And Roberto Benigni, it's a story of a man who falls in love with his wife, and together they have a child. And this man is actually a Jewish man. And it takes place during the era of Nazi Germany. And as the story unfolds, the man and his son are taken to a concentration camp. And one of the reasons why this story had such a powerful effect on people was in the story, it's a story of how he, as a comedian, he playfully is able to endure some of the harshest conditions in the Holocaust with his son by trying to convince his son that they're part of this funny game that they're in the midst of a concentration camp. And I think one of the reasons why so many people have been drawn to this film is because there's this whimsy and joy in the midst of what is a catastrophic, painful event. And I remember watching the film and just being brought to tears. A reminder that life can be beautiful when we can cling to hopefulness. And Viktor Frankl talks about this in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, as a Holocaust survivor. And he reflects himself on what was the difference between those who were able to survive in the midst of incredibly painful circumstances. It was those who had hope in something larger, in something enduring. And that's what the Christian story is all about. It's about being able to cling to hope even in the midst of the darkest moments. This past year has probably been a fair share of dark moments. Last week, Sarah had that moment where she invited us to write down the names of people that we know who passed away. And I know that list was actually a smaller list than what I've been journeying with many of you all, with different deaths that you all have experienced. Some of us have struggled through loneliness and depression in this season. Some of us have struggled through relational conflict and strife. Some of us have struggled because Tom Brady won the Super Bowl. Some of us have struggled through death and despair and the loss of work and income and pain. It's been a really difficult season. And yet the invitation today is, will you, in the midst of beauty and disappointment, will we cling to hope? Will we cling to life being beautiful? Now, again, this isn't to dismiss it, because once we go to this, oh, everything's all great and peachy keen, we've lost an element of the Christian message, which really is a depiction of real life, which is life is intermingling of beauty and disappointment. But in the midst of it, we remain hopeful. Maybe some of you've wrestled with some issues with your own family or your marriage, and it's been really difficult. And maybe you've been kind of losing some hope. Well, today, what if the invitation to you was like the author of the book of Lamentations can write, yet this I call to mind, yet this I call to mind. I will cling to hope. I've been trying to find the source of this one sermon that I read years ago, and it was written by this pastor who was preaching, who was in the midst of battling terminal cancer. And he actually writes his reflections on this verse, and it's the verse Romans chapter 5, verse 8. He says, but God demonstrates his love for us in this, while we were yet sinners. And the Greek word for yet is the word eti. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And in his reflections, he writes about how whatever might befall us, hell or high water, while we were yet sinners, while the world felt like it was falling apart around us, while some of the suffering and difficulty that we experience is due to our own sinfulness, while some of it's due to circumstances beyond our control, that seems like a mystery. While the whole brokenness of the world, especially even the catastrophic things that we experience, yet Christ died for us. He died for you. He died for me. He is for you. He is for me. He is for us. In the midst of beauty and disappointment, yet he died for us. He would experience the ultimate darkness that we might receive his buoyant light and joy. So that you, whatever darkness you might be experiencing, you can cling to yet this I call to mind, yet Christ died for us, yet Christ is for us. This pastor who authors this sermon, he ends his sermon with this line that he repeats over and over. And it's a line that I've come to tell myself over and over. And it's this line. It's, my hope is in eti. Again, that word eti is this word yet. My hope is in eti. My hope is in, though the world feels like it's caving in around me, yet Christ died for us. Yet this I call to mind. Yet there is a hope that even the darkest valley cannot overcome. I'm going to pray for us as we close today. And I simply want to offer this prayer, especially for those of you who have suffered in a unique way, or maybe you're just going through the doldrums of life. And maybe today you're clinging to something, you're looking for something to cling to. And maybe the invitation for you is to put your hope in eti. And by that, I mean, put your hope in the risen Jesus who would die for you and loves you and is for you.